Okay, this is lecture 2. We're going to be talking about the period after Herod and Jewish life in the first century. So beginning with the history after Herod the Great, and let's talk about Herod the Great's successors. And first of all, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. When Herod died, he left a will in which he divided his kingdom among 3 sons. Archelaus would govern Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. Antipas would govern Galilee and Perea. Philip would take charge of the territories north and east of Galilee. But at the beginning of their reigns, some serious disturbances broke out in Jerusalem during Passover, and when the Roman garrison was sent against the crowd, 3,000 Jews were killed. Antipas and Archelaus both wanted to govern the country, and both presented their appeal to the emperor. In the end, the emperor left the division as put forth in Herod's will, but he placed Archelaus on probation. At this time, a Jewish delegation requested that none of the sons of Herod be allowed to govern them, thinking that it would be a lesser evil to be governed directly by the Romans than to remain under this family. Even though the request was supported by thousands of Jews living in Rome, the appeal was rejected. Archelaus, however, failed his test, alienating the Jews so greatly that in AD 6, they appealed loudly to Rome for him to be removed, a petition that Augustus, granted. Judea became a Roman province governed by a procurator who answered to the Caesar and only secondarily to the governor of Syria. His headquarters was in Caesarea instead of Jerusalem. This arrangement was only rescinded once during 3 years, AD 41 to 44, in which Herod Agrippa I was allowed to rule over the Jews. That is why, when they wanted to crucify Jesus, the Jews took him before the Roman procurator, who at that time was Pontius Pilate. Antipas ruled over Galilee and Perea from 4 BC to AD 39. Jesus lived most of his life in the region of Galilee under the rule of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the one who had John the Baptist decapitated. He had taken his niece Herodias, a daughter of Aristobulus, as wife, even though she was married to his brother Philip. John the Baptist condemned the union, and Herodias schemed with her own daughter to have him killed. He was also the one who was visiting Jerusalem when Jesus was crucified. The Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate, sent Jesus to Herod Antipas when he discovered that Jesus was a native of Galilee. But Antipas refused to rule on the case and returned him to Pilate. Let's move on to point 2, the procurators, and the first instance of it. There were several Roman procurators from AD 6 onward, Pontius Pilate being the most famous. He governed from AD 26 to 36. He was a weak man of few convictions. He almost always faced conflicts with the Jews who did not trust him and hated him. He embezzled funds and held Jewish religious customs in disdain, defying their leaders every turn. Herod Agrippa I. So Herod Agrippa I succeeded his uncle Philip as governor of the territory north and east of the Sea of Galilee. His father was Aristobulus IV, a son of Herod the Great by Mariamne, whom he had put to death in 7 BC for supposed treason. When Herod Antipas died, Herod Agrippa I also took over his territory, Galilee and Perea. Herod Agrippa I was also the brother of Herodias, who was condemned as an adulteress by John the Baptist. We find Herod Agrippa I in the book of Acts. He was the one who had James, the son of Zebedee and brother of John, killed by the sword. He was also the one who jailed Peter. Throughout this period, the tension between the Jewish people and their Roman governors was increasing. Though Jesus taught submission to human governments in temporal matters, as also did the Apostle Paul, the Jewish people in general were ever angrier with Rome. The Emperor Caligula, who reigned from 37 to 41, offended the Jews greatly when he ordered that a statue of himself be set up in the temple in Jerusalem. Herod Agrippa I was able to slow down the implementation of the order, and Caligula died before it was enforced. When Caligula died, Agrippa I took part in the negotiations that made his friend Claudius, from AD 41 to 45, emperor. In gratitude, Claudius removed the Roman procurators from Judea and added this territory as well to his already extensive domain. He granted him a territory almost as large as that governed by Herod the Great. Even though the Jews finally thought they had someone in charge who would be concerned about Jewish interests, Agrippa I ruled over this territory only from 41 to 44 when he died. Luke tells of his sudden and horrific death consumed by worms because he accepted the people's acclamation of him as God. Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote late in the 1st century, described his death in much the same way. So let's talk about the procurators again, the second instance. Herod Agrippa II is involved here. So after the death of Herod Agrippa I, Roman procurators were established once more in Judea, and Herod Agrippa II, who was the son of Agrippa I and was only 17 years old, governed over Galilee, Perea, and the territory north and east of the Sea of Galilee. Claudius was succeeded by Nero, and under Nero, relations with Rome came to the breaking point. Pilate had been bad enough, but the procurators who followed him were worse. All his successors, with the exception of Festus, demonstrated a high indifference toward the Jews, and they became wealthy, embezzling from the people. Roman politic was permissive with this as long as the necessary taxes were turned in. The New Testament mentions two of these procurators in the book of Acts. Felix was procurator in Judea from AD 52 to 60. He was married to Drusilla, daughter of Herod Agrippa I and sister of Herod Agrippa II. During his governance, Paul went on his third missionary journey. Felix was succeeded by Festus from 60 to 62. Paul was brought before both procurators when he was arrested in 58 in Jerusalem and later moved to the prison in Caesarea Maritima, where he remained 2 years until AD 60. Under Festus, Paul appealed to the Caesar to avoid being taken again to Jerusalem because the Jews had prepared an ambush to murder him. Before sending him to the Caesar, Festus consulted with Herod Agrippa II, who was visiting with his wife Bernice. Paul expounded his faith before the three and called them to faith. Although they did not surrender to Jesus, they recognized that Paul was innocent. So at this point in your notes, you have a little family tree for the family of Herod. So let me just kind of read off of this, and you can fill in some information to help you keep them straight. We just have the names for Antipater and then Herod the Great and then Phasael. But when we get to the next generation, starting with Aristobulus IV, you could say that he was executed in 7 BC by order of his father Herod the Great for supposed treason. With Archelaus, 4 BC to AD 6, you could write that he governed over Idumea, Judea, and Samaria from 4 BC to AD 6 when he was deposed because of his incompetence. Archelaus, from 4 BC to AD 6, governed Galilee and Perea during Jesus' lifetime. He decapitated John the Baptist. He saw Jesus the night of his trial as he visited Jerusalem because Pilate sent him to him. Moving on to Philip, 4 BC, AD 34. He governed the territories north and east of Galilee. We can then talk about Herod Agrippa I. He first governed north and east of Galilee in AD 34. Later, he also governed over Galilee and Perea in AD 39, and finally also over Idumea, Judea, and Samaria, AD 41, so that in his final years he ruled over a territory almost as large as that of Herod the Great, his grandfather. He had James, son of Zebedee and brother of John, killed by the sword, and he put Peter in prison. He died consumed by worms while being acclaimed as a god. For Herodias, we can say she married her uncle Philip and later left him to be with her other uncle Antipas. When John the Baptist condemned their union, she plotted to have Antipas decapitate him. And in the final box, Herod Agrippa II, you could write in there that when his father Agrippa I died, he was only 17 years old. So Rome took from him Idumea, Samaria, and Judea, and established procurators again. He first governed over Chalcis, that's Chalcis, north of Damascus, AD 48 to 53. Later, he also ruled north and east of Galilee, starting in AD 53, and finally over Galilee and Perea in AD 61. He was the last of the Herodian dynasty. Procurator Festus allowed Paul to present his case before him and his wife Bernice before they sent him to Caesar. Okay, let's continue with the second point here. Nero, who reigned from AD 54 to 68. Apparently, Paul came before Nero and was freed at some point between AD 61 and 63. He visited Titus in Crete, and we don't know what else he did before returning to Rome, where he was executed in late AD 67 or early 68. He died at the end of Nero's rule. We don't know if the persecution Nero unleashed against Christians to cover up his own burning of a section of Rome that he wanted to rebuild, if that's what led Paul to return to the capital where he was arrested, or if, being such a prominent Christian, an arrest warrant was sent out from Rome to bring him back as a prisoner. Either way, both Paul and Peter died in Rome at the end of Nero's reign. The final years of Nero were marked by widespread dissatisfaction. In the year AD 66, rebellion broke out in Palestine. Let's talk then about the year of 4 emperors, Vespasian and Titus. So after the death of Nero in AD 68, a civil war broke out in the Roman Empire. It was a period of great unrest. The year AD 69 was particularly turbulent. In that one year, the year of the 4 emperors, 4 men held the title of Caesar: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian rose to power. While he was consolidating his power in Rome, Vespasian sent his son Titus, general of the Roman army, to take care of securing the land of Israel. So let's talk about the second Jewish rebellion. This happens later on. Judas of Galilee had led the zealots to resist the census of the Jewish people that was carried out after the deposition of Archelaus in AD 6. This group became ever stronger and less scrupulous in its resistance and was an important factor in inciting people to open rebellion. In the end, open rebellion broke out beginning in Caesarea Maritima in AD 66. When the Roman troops descended from the north, the famous Jewish historian Josephus surrendered to them in Yodfat, that's Y-O-D-F-A-T, of Galilee, and became a consultant for Vespasian and his son Titus on regional matters. Later on, he wrote his books on Jewish history for the Romans. Josephus accompanied Titus on his march south. He appealed to Jerusalem to surrender. Titus had promised not to destroy the temple if they surrendered, but the 2 extremist leaders in Jerusalem, John of Giscala and Simon Bar-Giora, refused. Simon Bar-Giora was the leader of the famous zealots known as the Sicarii, S-I-C-A-R-I-I, or men of the dagger, terrorists who murdered many during the period of revolt. In the year AD 70, Roman troops entered Jerusalem, plundered the city, and destroyed the temple. In 72, they destroyed the temple in Leontopolis, Egypt. Masada, the final Jewish fortress, fell in AD 73. By now, this event was not the devastating blow to Christians that it had been for Jews, since Christians did not participate in the revolution. And by this time, Christianity had spread mostly to Gentiles. On to point 5, Domitian, AD 81 to 96. At the end of the 1st century, Emperor Domitian ruled. It is important to note his reign because many believe that this was the time in which Revelation was written, and also the time in which the Gospel of John was finalized. There was an important persecution against Christians at this time because Domitian encouraged the emperor cult, insisting on being addressed as Supreme Lord and God. As a result, especially in Asia Minor, local authorities were eager to fan the emperor cult as a means of demonstrating loyalty to Rome and to Domitian. Christians who refused to worship the emperor were persecuted and accused of treason. Also, Josephus wrote his historical books under Roman commission during this time. And now let's move on to another major point. Point number 2. The New Testament world. Let's talk about Second Temple Judaism. Historians have adopted the term Second Temple Judaism to refer to Jewish culture in the period from the reconstruction of the temple after the return from captivity near the end of the 6th century BC to its destruction in the year AD 70. The term might seem confusing given that the temple of Jesus' day was, for all intents and purposes, the third temple built in Jerusalem. Herod built the temple around the existing reconstructed temple using marble and Roman architectural techniques. Then the old building was dismantled from within. Technically, the Jews considered this a renovation. First century Judaism closes out the very end of the period known as Second Temple Judaism. So let's talk about the temple and its cult. In the days of Jesus, the temple was the center of Jewish life. Jews believed their world was sustained by 3 things: the law, Torah, the temple service, and acts of kindness. The temple cult describes Jewish thought about humankind and the nearness of persons to God. There were well-defined areas that represented how close or far one was from God. From each inferior level, one ascended to the next by a series of steps. Drawing near to God was an ascent. And some ancient writers describe the glory of the temple as the ascent of a mountain. The temple areas were the following. 1. The court of Gentiles. This was the section outside the temple proper into which anyone could enter. And 2. The court of women. Here all Jews could enter, including Jewish women. 3. The court of Israel. Though nothing in the law of Moses called for a segregation by gender, at this time Jews had divided men and women into 2 distinct groups. Only circumcised Jewish males were allowed to enter the court of Israel. 4. The court of priests. Here only Jewish priests could enter. In this area was found the bronze altar in front of the entrance to the temple, which led into the holy place. And 5. The holy place. Here priests entered only when their service cycles dictated. In here was the table of the presence, the golden lampstand, and the altar of incense. And 6, the Holy of Holies. Here only the high priest entered 1 day a year to offer the annual sacrifice, placing blood on the mercy seat that was over the Ark of the Covenant. This represented the very presence of God. This organization into 6 groups represented Jewish thought in Jesus' day. These were the spheres into which people fell, differentiated by their closeness to God. By birth, then, no woman could ever have direct personal access to God. Her access came through a father or a husband. The high priest was the only one who could have direct access to God. He entered annually in representation of Israel. 2. The Sanhedrin. This was typically made up of 71 members presided over by the high priest, and it functioned as the Jewish Supreme Court. They had their own temple guards and could issue arrest warrants. 3. The synagogue. These were the Jewish schools established throughout the world wherever there were Jewish colonies. The leader of the synagogue led the school, performed circumcisions, buried the dead, and led worship services. Sacrifices were not offered in the synagogues. The temple was the only place for offering sacrifices. The destruction of the temple in AD 70 forced the Jews who did not believe in Jesus Christ to reinvent themselves, to practice the Jewish religion without a temple. 4. Political and religious groups. Let's begin with the Pharisees. The Pharisees descended from the Hasidim, the pious ones, of the Maccabean revolt. They felt greater affinity for Persian rather than Greek culture. They were the anti-Hellenists of their day. Their greatest sphere of influence was the synagogue. Because they were considered experts in Scripture, they were likely the most influential group in Jesus' day. They were typically from the middle class, not the high class. Though Pharisees are often thought of as strictly conservative because of their obsession with purity, they were in some ways the theologically liberal group. They believed that the Bible, the Torah, existed in two forms, and that both had been transmitted from the days of Moses: the written Torah, our Old Testament, and the oral Torah. The oral Torah is what Jesus called the tradition of the elders. It includes a series of interpretations about the meaning of the written Torah. The Pharisees believed that the oral tradition should not be written down. It had to be memorized and kept orally. Later on, after the rebellion of Simon Bar Kokhba, that's K-O-K-B-A, in AD 132 through 135, when Jerusalem was completely razed and the Jews found themselves in danger of being wiped out, they changed their minds and began to write down their oral tradition. For the Pharisees, this oral tradition was just as authoritative as the Scriptures themselves. Jesus affirmed the authority of Scripture, but flatly denied the authority of the oral tradition, deliberately breaking it in his ministry. The Pharisees, according to Josephus, who claimed to be a Pharisee, believed in predestination, physical resurrection, in a cosmic dynamic of reward and punishment at the final judgment, and in angelic and demonic hierarchies. Several of these elements can be seen clearly in the words of Jesus and the writings of the ex-Pharisee Paul. 2. The Sadducees. The Sadducees were of the high class, the aristocracy, the politicians and power brokers. They were pro-Hellenic. They believed that one could be a pious Jew without rejecting all Greek culture. If the Pharisees could be considered liberal with regard to the Scriptures, placing their interpretations and their oral tradition on the same level as the Scriptures, the Sadducees were conservatives. They rejected the authority of the oral tradition altogether. They even rejected any Scripture not attributed to Moses. For them, only the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, were authoritative. Jesus, when he argued with the Sadducees in favor of the resurrection, appealed to the Pentateuch, citing God who identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They did not believe in resurrection, final judgment, or in a life after death. They centered their lives on the temple and the priesthood. Their spheres of influence were the temple and the Sanhedrin. They were the counterpart in Jewish life to the Pharisees. They're opposites on many points. 3. Essenes. What were they known by? Well, one characteristic that marked Essenes was that they shared communal life. The Essenes believed that life in the cities was already too corrupt. Even under the influence of the Pharisees, the only way to keep pure in observation of God's laws was to be separate from the world and live in deserted places in small communities. Adepts entered for a year of probation, after which, if they were accepted, they took on an oath of loyalty to the Essene community. They were given a ritual bath of purification and gave the group all their possessions. They were given a white cloak, a loincloth, and a hatchet to dig and cover when they used the restroom. They were also marked by two, a rejection of marriage and family. The Essenes adopted sons but had no wives. They neither married nor allowed women in their group. 3, they were organized into groups. The Essenes practiced devout disciplines in their daily living. Since they did not participate in the life of the temple, they worked and performed daily religious activities where they were. And 4, part of a rural anti-establishment movement. In one sense, the Essenes were kind of the hippies of their time. They formed small communities of people disillusioned with their current society, scattered throughout the land of Israel. The Qumran community and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's talk a little bit about that. The most famous Essene group today is the Qumran sect. The Dead Sea Scrolls, their copies of the scriptures and other documents, date back from 200 BC to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, when they hid everything in caves and fled. The Romans killed them, and no one was left to return and retrieve the scrolls. That is why those scrolls in caves near the Dead Sea were preserved, thanks to the extremely arid climate in that region. The texts of great antiquity which they left behind have been the most important archaeological find of the 20th century. They were crucial in curbing the revisionist scholarship in the 19th century, when it was assumed that there were many corruptions in the transmission of the biblical text, and experts often modified the Hebrew text as they saw fit. These extremely ancient texts demonstrated that the variations over more than 1,000 years of transmission were minimal. And they gave great support to the reliability of the Masoretic text, the MT, of the Old Testament. Caution must be exercised when reading commentaries prior to around 1960, when this speculative and revisionist period began to close in scholarly circles. And 4, let's talk about zealots. The zealots were basically a paramilitary terrorist movement. They had an affinity for the Pharisees and were extremely anti-Rome. During the rebellion of AD 66 through 70, the assassin group known as the Sicarii, men of the dagger, arose from the zealots. Let's talk about Herodians. Number 5, Herodians. This group that favored the government of the family of Herod was the counterpart to the Zealots. They were pro-Rome and had an affinity for the Sadducees. If the Zealots wanted to remove the Roman government, the Herodians would prefer for it to stay the way it was. And then 6, the people of the land. This group made up 90% of the population. It was made up by all the rest who simply lived in the land of Israel. They were the poor, the Gentiles, those who were not involved in leadership in any religious or political group. They were the nameless masses. And let me give some words of conclusion. It is important to note the great diversity that there was in Jewish culture in Jesus' day. After the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and the expulsion of the Jews after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in AD 135, only the Pharisaic tradition, the tradition of the rabbis, survived. They reinvented Judaism based on rabbinic oral traditions and substituted the services of the synagogue for the temple cult. In the place of sacrifices of expiation, they substituted 3 daily prayers that every good Jew must pray. Modern Judaism descends from only one Jewish sector. The influence of the Sadducees, Levites, Essenes, Zealots, and Herodians was lost in the Jewish revolts. Much of what is said about the Jews in the days of Jesus is based on later rabbinic tradition and might not represent the opposing viewpoints of Jewish segments of society that also existed at that time. It is amazing to see how a coalition formed of all opposing Jewish elements to kill Jesus. In John 11:47, the Pharisees joined the chief priests, who were Sadducees, to find a way to arrest Jesus. In Matthew 22:16, during Jesus' final week in Jerusalem before his death, we read an amazing fact. The Pharisees, with an affinity towards the revolutionary zealots and an anti-Roman spirit, joined the Herodians, people who favored Roman rule and the family of Herod, to try to trip up Jesus on some word. Such was the tremendous impact that Jesus had on every stratum of his society. We must also note that Jesus incorporated this diversity in his group of disciples. It is miraculous that he was able to join together a man sold out to the Romans as a tax collector, Matthew or Levi, the publican, and in the same group, a zealot extremist, Simon, in the same group. Let's talk a little bit about languages and education. A final note is important. After the deportation to Babylon, a great number of Jews remained in the East. From this moment forward, there was a progressive change in languages in Israel. The Jews in Jesus' day spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew. The two are sister languages. In Jesus' day, there were paraphrased translations of Bible books from Hebrew to Aramaic, and in synagogue readings, they generally first read the Hebrew version, followed by the Aramaic translation. These translations were called Targums, T-A-R-G-U-M. Given that common Greek was the universal language in Jesus' day, everyone had at least some knowledge of it. It is likely that Jesus was trilingual, understanding and speaking Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Jews had centered their lives on the synagogue. Their educational system was based on memorization. It is difficult for us to imagine it today, but scholars in Jesus' day had memorized huge texts and oral traditions with great precision, word for word. They also used Hebrew literary tendencies such as parallelism to help in memorization. In order to live as Jews, they had to know the law. This is why among Jewish males there was a very high literacy rate, more than 90%. The Jews were one of the most literate people in antiquity. In antiquity, people did not read silently. No one read to him or herself. Greek was written without punctuation signs or space between the words, as was Hebrew. The sounds had to be vocalized out loud to understand the text. The habit of reading without vocalizing the text is a modern development. Writing was taught separately from reading, and few learned how to do this. The custom at the time was to hire professional secretaries known as amanuenses, A-M-A-N-U-E-N-S-E-S, who would help write up documents. Paul, though he knew how to write, used this kind of helpers. In his letters, he mentions co-workers. This explains the high level of Greek in letters such as James or 1 Peter. Letters were often collaborative works between the primary author and the amanuensis, who infused better word choices, grammar, and polish to the text.